Hello and welcome to Nothing But the Truth. As the Modi government completes 6 months in office, we ask, how effectively is it handling the economy? How strong is its commitment to reform? Those are the two key issues I should raise today with one of India's foremost economists, Professor of Economics at America's Columbia University, Arvind Panagriya. Professor Panagriya, before I come to details, let me ask you a broad general question about the Modi government's handling of the economy. Are you impressed or are you disappointed?
Well, somewhere in the middle, I would say. We are not as far as I would have liked us to be where we should have been. On the other hand, I think, if I compare what the Modi government has done in 6 months, I think it's more than perhaps almost any other government that has done in the first 6 months.
So you're saying compared to its predecessors, this government is very impressive.
Yes.
But compared to your expectations, it hasn't lived up to them.
Well, I sort of hope that at least in some of the dimensions we'll be farther along than we are right now. But, in
other words, you would have hoped for more bold action.
Well, I had hoped for somewhat different actions, meaning therefore that there are some dimensions in which I didn't expect and they did things. On the other hand, there are some dimensions in which I had hoped they would do things and they have not happened.
All right, I want very much to talk about both of those areas where they acted where you didn't think they would act and therefore you're impressed, areas where you hoped they would act and they haven't and therefore you're disappointed. But let's come to that in a moment's time when I take up the question about reforms and how bold this government is. Let's first begin with the state of the economy. In September, industrial production grew by 2.5%, inflation grew by only 5.5%, and both of those were better than anticipated. Does this suggest to you that growth is reviving and inflation is curbing, or is it too early to come to that conclusion?
No, I think we are on the right track, and we are certainly coming out of the woods. I also see this in terms of the actions taken, as well as the outcomes that we are seeing. So we are certainly coming out of woods. But, I want to see the economy grow 8, 9, 10%. So we are some distance away from there.
It's interesting you say we're coming out of the woods, but I take it we're still very much in the woods because experts point out that if you look at what is likely to be the GDP growth figure for the July-September period, it will be significantly lower than the 5.7% achieved in April-June. And that's because industrial production and exports have both slowed down and agriculture has taken a hit from the bad monsoon. And equally, if you look at the Kharif output, which is going to be something like 9 or 10, maybe even 11 million tons less than last year, you'll back with pressure on inflation. So it's a zigzag, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure there is a zigzag. You might not get 5.7, but you'll get something, it's not significantly below. So I'd still expect it to be above 5, because remember that at the end of the day, services account for a very large proportion of our GDP.
That will be the saving grace.
That will be the saving grace.
Now, the first big challenge on the horizon for the government is, in fact, the fiscal deficit target of 4.1%. On Thursday, this government has raised excise duties on petrol and diesel, which is a sure sign they're concerned. Do you think 4.1% can be met?
I think the way things are now going, because this is clearly one symptom of that they have gone and raised the excise taxes. They took advantage actually of the decline in the global prices. So I think they're moving in the correct direction. It is still a little dicey. So I don't say that you'll hit 4.1, but on the other hand, I've always maintained that, 4.1 or 4.3, that's not a big difference, and I think we are within that margin.
Let's explore this question of how dicey it is. I know the good side is that the international price of oil has fallen below $80 a barrel.
Right.
But the problem for the government is that the increase in indirect taxes, which is pretty close to 45-46% of the government's total take from taxes altogether, has only been in the first 6 months roughly 5.6%. The budget target is an increase of 20% over the year. And as a result, 83% of the fiscal deficit has already been consumed by the 1st of November, and we've got 5 months still left. Does that worry you?
No, we should be careful, and certainly if I'm running the economy, it would worry me. But at the same time, remember that there are steps being taken. So excise taxes is one thing you pointed out. Also on the LPG subsidy, for instance, they've now gone to the direct transfers. That's going to make a difference to
in the sense that the leakage
subsidy
will be less, and therefore there'll be a saving on subsidy.
It will be, so we'll be saving there.
But remember, that only comes into effect on the 1st of January. And that means just 3 months left for it to actually tell.
True, but that still is for 3 months. You'll make some progress there on that front. And at the end of the day, it is possible that some expenditures will have to be cut as we get closer.
That would be a repetition of what Chidambaram did twice. Is it desirable when growth is your other concern?
Well, some of it, remember that some of the cuts often happen because of the way the expenditures themselves are set. And
you mean money doesn't get spent?
States are not able to spend the kind of money that actually is allocated.
Which is better than cutting, but it's not a satisfactory outcome either.
No. I mean, in the longer run, what you would like to set it up in a way that states are able to spend. But
let me put it like this. Suppose the finance minister doesn't make 4.1. How much will that worry and concern A, international rating agencies, and B, international investors? Because the fiscal deficit is something people look at, and people hope a government can stick to its commitment.
Look, I have always maintained that this very red line kind of thing, 4.1 is.
What if it goes above 4.3? Suppose it comes in at 4.5, 4.6.
Well, it certainly then will worry the ratings agencies, and
then a downgrade
how
is possible?
Precisely. Well, I'm not sure that will lead to. Again, that depends on what else the government is doing. So ratings agencies never look. I think the press seems to always think that it is the fiscal deficit single number that determines the action of the ratings agencies. That's simply not true.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right when you say that investors and rating agencies will be looking not just at the fiscal deficit, not just at the narrow growth figure, but at what else the government does. And I promise I'll come to what else the government does in a moment's time. But give me one more question on the present state of the economy. If there are no dramatic changes in the domestic or international situation, in other words, there are no great shocks to the system, what do you think the GDP growth rate will be for the year ending March 31, 2015?
Well, that's looking at the crystal ball, but if you insist on a sort of figure...
Economists do it all the time.
Well, good economists stay away from forecasting, but I'll be a bad economist and make a judgment, So maybe I'll expect it somewhere between 5 and 5.5%. Which is better than the last 2 years.
All right, let's come, Professor Panagriya, to that tantalizing thought that you've repeated several times in this interview. It all depends upon what else the government is doing. And that clearly means that it depends upon the steps the government's taking to push reform. And that's the second part of this interview. Now, there is a view, not just in India but abroad, that how the Modi government handles its economic challenges is very different to how it handles its political challenges. On the political front, as Maharashtra and Haryana showed, the Modi government is bold, it's adventurous, it's decisive, it's pushing forward. But when it comes to the economic challenges in terms of reforms, it's cautious, it's careful, some people say it's timid. Instead of the bold strides people were hoping for, we've only seen small incremental steps. To what extent do you agree with that interpretation of Mr. Modi?
No, actually, if you were paying attention to what Mr. Modi was saying to the press in his interviews during the election campaign, you would not arrive at the conclusion that you have arrived at. He always said, when reporters asked him, is there going to be this 100-day Big Bang reform program, he always said that, no, this is not how the government is run. And you have to go step by step. So it is nevertheless what did happen is that because Mr. Modi scored such a huge victory, everybody's expectations, including mine, went up. We all wanted action faster.
Because suddenly he had the numbers to act fast and not be hesitant.
Absolutely.
So regardless of the caution in his speeches during the campaign, the size and scale of his victory led to expectations, and realistic expectations.
Yeah.
Have those expectations been let down?
Yeah. Well, now again, there's a lot of action that has been done by the government, but it is Mr. Modi's style. So it's really the way actions are being taken, it is clearly Mr. Modi's way of doing it. And first thing he wanted to set right here was the governance. I mean, when he came in, The decision-making process in the PMO, in the cabinet, was a complete mess.
Quite right.
has tried
He did
to
away
clear
with
that.
GOMs, he did away with EGOMs, he's spoken directly to the bureaucracy, he's energized the system, all of that I accept.
Absolutely.
But all of that amounts to good governance. What we have is faster decision making, better implementation, a more responsive bureaucracy. That's good governance. Is it sufficient to get us back to 8%?
There is a scenario you can paint that you could get there with that, because remember that in terms of the policies, these are the policies that existed when we grew from 2003-4 to 2011-12.
In other words,
above
if
8%.
these policies could deliver 8-9 under Manmohan Singh, then with better governance they can deliver it again.
In principle, that is a possibility.
But
You
it
can't
doesn't
rule
sound,
out.
it doesn't
is
sound as
possible.
if you agree with that, though.
No, I would like us to go to 10% or 11%.
That's
therefore,
where you need
Therefore, I
reforms.
do want the reforms to move forward.
Now that's what I want to come to. You see, you say you want the reforms to move forward. There is an argument made that the Modi government talks more about reforms than it actually delivers. For instance, let me give you a couple of examples. It hasn't reversed retrospective taxation. It's only promised not to do it again. On land acquisition, it's not talking about making acquisition cheaper or easier. It's only going to extend the list of exemptions. On labor laws, it's not really talking about achieving hire and fire, even with caps and limitations. It's actually only talking about making Provident Fund portable or reducing the scope and area for vexatious inspections. And even when you come to the coal mining ordinance, technically on paper, it's promised to open up mining to commercial mining. But in fact, it hasn't set a date for doing so, and Piyush Goyal, the concerned minister, doesn't hesitate to say it's not going to happen for 2-3 years. So people turn around and say, there's a lot of talk and rhetoric, but the delivery is disappointing.
Yeah. Now, again, this is a government that's not going to sit back. Initial steps have been steps that are more administrative, not legislative. The issue, of course, is that when things don't work as well as they thought would work with these actions, actions will be taken. Now you see that the tone has changed. For example, initially Land Acquisition Act was not on the anvil for being amended. It now is.
But the amendment is only to increase the list of exemptions, not to make
we
it
don't
cheaper
know that.
and
We
easier.
don't know that. No. There have been proposals. There have been other proposals.
Just
actually.
a moment. I'm quoting Mr. Jaitley in the interview to NDTV where he laid out the list of exemptions that would happen, making it clear. That's what he did.
That's one of the things. That's one of the things. But there is also proposals from, in fact, Mr. Gadkari when he was holding the portfolio.
Absolutely, and those
which go much farther.
Absolutely. Those proposals date back to June and they raised great expectation, but unfortunately on those proposals no action has been taken.
No. It is true. But again, this is where I'm saying that Mr. Modi initially went with the setting up of the administrative governance properly, and he is waiting. So he's going to go step by step.
Let me put it like
this is not a government.
Let me put it like this.
Let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
so this is a government which is not going to sit back and.
How do you know that?
would say.
How do you know that?
No. Because actions always things that have not happened. Actions.
But the problem
are being-
is that this government is acting incrementally and slowly rather than radically and boldly.
But if you go by what Mr. Modi had said from the beginning, even prior to winning the election, it fits the pattern that he had, and that's the pattern he followed in Gujarat as well.
Let me put two things to you. Last week, Mr. Chidambaram, maybe he was only scoring political points, but Mr. Chidambaram said that if he had 282, he would have immediately scrapped and reversed retrospective taxation.
Well,
Now, that's something that you know better than me has created great disquiet amongst international investors. It's given India a bad name. And Mr. Jaitley knows it, Mr. Modi knows it. Yet they haven't acted on that one front, and they could have done it with ease. All it needed was a line in Mr. Jaitley's budget. Do you think it was a mistake not to bite that bullet?
well, on that I have written. I have said that retrospective taxation should have been ended in a clean way.
So this is a mistake.
So I agree with that.
So this is a mistake.
Whatever you want to call it, those are your words. But I think ultimately it was Mr. Jaitley's call. But we may
the wrong call.
may disagree. Well, he went as far as probably politics allowed him to go, just sticking to one thing is not what is going to ultimately,
Let me pick up on that thought of yours. He went as far as politics will probably allow him to go. That's the second question I wanted to ask you. Mr. Jaitley keeps saying that reform is the art of the possible, that you can only do what consensus will permit. And that makes it clear that difficult reforms, where clearly labor law reforms come in, won't happen for 2-3 years at least. The opposite viewpoint is that when a government has an unprecedented 282 MPs in the Lok Sabha, it has enormous political capital and it can bite difficult bullets. But if you don't bite them immediately, that capital will fritter away. Worse still, unforeseen, unexpected problems would hit you, as they hit all governments, and then you'll be distracted and deflected.
No. Look, go back to the NDA 1. What happened? In the first 6 months, 8 months, hardly any action happened during that government's reign. Look at the reforms that they did.
It's very interesting.
There was an accumulation of reforms. These were done gradually. Yashwant Sinha did it gradually.
It's very interesting.
Yashwant Sinha did it gradually.
No, the point is,
but look at the accumulation of reforms over the years.
Let me give you an example that actually disproves you. 10 years ago, at least, Yashwant Sinha promised labor law reforms. It was in one of his early budgets. It hasn't happened. It wasn't delivered.
It didn't happen because the UPA came in for 10 years.
He was there for 6.
Wait a minute.
He was there for 6. For the last 2 years, he wasn't even finance minister.
No. The reform was discussed in that.
But it didn't happen. Discussion is not sufficient.
Wait a minute. Why are you forgetting the huge amounts of reforms that did happen?
But this didn't happen.
You think we got this 8% growth, 8.3% growth over a 9-year period starting in 2003-04 for nothing?
Let's not get into a quarrel over Yashwant Sinha. The truth is he did promise it but didn't deliver it.
But he delivered so much. He delivered so much.
Yeah, but
not everything that is promised passes the political muster.
So you're saying to me that it doesn't matter if we don't have...
Wait.
Let me finish the question, then you answer. You're saying to me it doesn't matter if we don't have bold reforms in terms of land acquisition, in terms of labor, or even in terms of coal mining or retrospective taxation. You're saying it doesn't matter. The incremental progress is sufficient.
No. The bold reform, it may not happen in one go. But incrementally, just look at in 6 years how much Yashwant Sinha.
Let's not go back to Yashwant Sinha. Let's stick to now.
Yeah. So come here.
As of this
come here in 6 months. What on labor laws, for example, Mr. Modi again from the beginning had said that he wants the states to move on, and states have moved on. I mean, within 6 months, one state, Rajasthan, has moved.
It's a cop-out, isn't it, to say that I won't do it at the center, that Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh do it? It's
not a cop-out.
It is. It says, Vasundhara Raje Scindia's strength and boldness I will borrow on.
No. In 65 years, we have not allowed the states to do the reforms on concurrent list. Finally, this government said, yes, we will allow.
Why can't this government do the reforms itself?
No, it will. Do not.
Central list.
It's been only 6 months. What do you think will happen in... everything can happen,
Can I put it like
6 months?
The Modi government makes a lot of make in India. That's not only critical to boosting the share of manufacturing in GDP from 15-16% to 25%, it's also critical to creating the jobs without which India's demographic dividend could turn into a democratic disaster. Can Make in India happen without critical fundamental labor and land acquisition reforms?
No, those reforms will happen.
When?
This is Mr. Modi certainly will, if he has said he wants the Make in India campaign to succeed, if it doesn't begin to happen, he will take the actions that are necessary to make it happen.
You're sounding almost as if you're spokesman for the Modi
what he has revealed himself in the last 6 months, that is my basis. Otherwise, how do you know he will not do it? How do you know? You tell me, how do you know that he will not do it?
I'm not saying I know he won't do it. I'm saying he's taking too long to do it.
No, 6 months. Even 6 months is not complete yet. You never held any other government to that kind of standard.
Okay. My last question before I change subjects. Mr. Modi went to America in September. He met some 20-odd CEOs. One of the key messages he got from practically every one of them was that they were happy and willing to come and invest in India, but they were looking for certain structural reforms to happen first. Writing at that time, the well-known American-Indian scholar Ashley Tellis said that the CEOs that Mr. Modi had approached, whose money he wants, whose investment India needs, were willing to come provided those structural reforms happen between now and the budget. They were prepared to wait till the budget. If they don't happen in the next budget, Ashley Tellis said they will conclude that if a man with Mr. Modi's mandate can't do it, then India is not going to do it ever. and they'll go elsewhere. Do you accept? So the budget is the deadline.
So we are talking of the 15-16 budget.
Yeah.
I think that has to be a very bold budget. I agree with that.
So in other words, that budget is a now or never situation for India.
That is a good litmus test. I think, see, the first budget, fair enough, it was an interim budget and the government takes time. Even the team really has not changed. But now remember, this is another indication. The way the team has been changed now, you got from my Rajasthan, Rajiv Maharishi, who drove the labor law reforms.
The entire bureaucracy of the finance ministry has changed, and you have a new chief economic advisor. So you're saying to me, that budget of March 2015 is the critical one.
It will be a critical one, yes.
If these critical reforms, I'm talking about labor, land acquisition, we're talking about coal mining, and I'll come in a moment's time to subsidies, reducing subsidies, if that doesn't happen substantially.
Now, again, it may happen over a period of time, but the budget 15-16 has to carry a very strong signal that things are beginning to happen. Not only that, I would expect that some of the reforms will have to come in even in the winter session.
If that signal isn't clearly and forcefully sent out, then what?
No, then I think we would probably be settling for a growth of 6 to 7%.
So that's a critical budget.
That's a critical budget.
In fact, it's a now or never moment.
Well, if you want to put it that way, I mean, those are not the words I use, but
you don't disagree. Budget. Professor Panagriya, in the limited time available, I want to come to subsidies. In the last budget, Mr. Jaitley appointed an Expenditure Management Commission under Bimal Jalan to advise the government on how to reduce subsidies, and he said that his next budget in February-March will act upon its recommendations. Now that report is due very shortly. Already, petrol and diesel have been deregulated. How deeply, rather than just cosmetically, does the government need to reduce subsidies in LPG, fertilizer, and perhaps even food?
Yeah, I think all of those need to be tackled. LPG, it seems to me that you can go from 12 cylinders to 6 cylinders pretty rapidly.
Just reduce the number allocated.
Absolutely. I think, this is a subsidy going to the middle class. These are not poor people whom you are giving this.
So far, the government hasn't thought of doing this. This is your advice to them. Reduce 12 to 6.
Because after all, UPA itself had reduced it to 6 and then it went back to 9 and then to 12.
So UPA can't complain.
Seems to me that you can come back to 6.
What about fertilizer subsidy?
I think we have to start taking action on that as well. Actually, again, Mr. Yashwant Sinha had moved on those subsidies. And then when the UPA came in, we reversed it. We reversed and regressed.
So you're saying go back to what Mr. Yashwant Sinha was trying, but go
restart
deeper.
The process.
But go deeper.
Yes, absolutely. Because again, there are a variety of arguments why that subsidy also needs to be.
What about food subsidies?
Now, food subsidy, I think, is a legitimate subsidy, but I would do it differently. I would personally prefer that we gradually move towards the cash transfers. I think the entire machinery that we have, procurement and public distribution, etc., needs to be trimmed some. But bigger point is that the people ought to be empowered. So once they have cash, they decide whether they want to buy it from a public distribution shop or from a private.
So the first thing you're saying is the food subsidy shouldn't be given in kind. It should be given in cash or direct transfer, so people can decide where they buy, whether it's from a PDS store or an open store.
Yes.
And the second thing you're saying is on food subsidy, do it gradually, but do it steadily.
As long as we are giving equivalent cash transfers to the people, subsidy bill itself is not going to be cut, remember. It's simply that people will end up with much greater benefit because the leakages, etc., that happen.
And greater choice.
And greater choice. And that will also force the public distribution system to shape up.
There is a proposal that the government might reduce NREGA and limit it to just the 200 poorest districts in the country. In a communication to the Times of India, you and your colleague Professor Bhagwati have endorsed this. Why do you believe this is the right step rather than a politically wrong step?
No, this is, again, the NREGA, the way it has been implemented, for the particular objective that it is trying to achieve, it seems to us that this is a very distortionary way of doing it. You are distorting the labor market. At the end of the day, the money that is ending up in the pockets of the beneficiaries is far less than the money being spent. All estimates suggest.
So correct the distortions by limiting it to the 200 most needy districts.
Well, that's one way to do it. Also, remember that if you're really going to run an employment program, it should be more related to distress. And then, so if there is drought, you put the activate the program. If there is no drought, then you know. Go. So cash subsidies, if you actually bring in, then you take care of the poor through the cash subsidies, and then the need for the employment subsidy through NREGA is much reduced.
My last question. Reducing subsidies is always a politically difficult thing for a government to do, given the lack of boldness, which admittedly you contest, on the other fronts like labour and land acquisition. Do you think this government will be bold when it comes to subsidy, or will it be careful and cautious?
Politically, it will be careful and cautious, but the reform can be achieved. Remember that the Aadhaar has been retained, the Jan Dhan has given the bank accounts, so the infrastructure actually the government, Mr. Modi, has created for cash subsidies.
So it's simply a question now of will.
It will happen. You'll see. It may take 2 years or 3 or 4. It will happen.
All right.
Because we really cannot afford the leakages that are going on right now in the system.
Professor Panagriya, a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you. No, I think we are on the right track, and we are certainly coming out of the woods. I also see this in terms of the actions taken, as well as the outcomes that we are seeing. So we are certainly coming out of woods, but I want to see the economy grow 8, 9, 10%. So we are some distance away from there.
It's interesting you say we're coming out of the woods, but I take it we're still very much in the woods, because experts point out that if you look at what is likely to be the GDP growth figure for the July-September period, it will be significantly lower than the 5.7% achieved in April-June. And that's because industrial production and exports have both slowed down, and agriculture has taken a hit from the bad monsoon. And equally,
as I would have liked us to see, be where we should have been. On the other hand, I think, if I compare what the Modi government has done in 6 months, I think it's more than perhaps almost any other government that has done in the first 6 months.
So you're saying compared to its predecessors, this government is very impressive.
Yes.
But compared to your expectations, it hasn't lived up to them.
Well, I sort of hope that at least in some of the dimensions we'll be farther along than we are right now. But in
other words, you would have hoped for more bold action.
Well, I had hoped for somewhat different actions. Meaning therefore that there are some dimensions in which I didn't expect, and they did.
Hello and welcome to Nothing But the Truth. As the Modi government completes 6 months in office, we ask, how effectively is it handling the economy? How strong is its commitment to reform? Those are the two key issues I should raise today with one of India's foremost economists, Professor of Economics at America's Columbia University, Arvind Panagriya. Professor Panagriya, before I come to details, let me ask you a broad general question about the Modi government's handling of the economy. Are you impressed or are you disappointed?
Well, somewhere in the middle, I would say. We are not as far.
If you look at the Kharif output, which is going to be something like 9 or 10, maybe even 11 million tons less than last year, you'll back with pressure on inflation. So it's a zigzag, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure there is a zigzag. You might not get 5.7, but you'll get something, it's not significantly below. So I'd still expect it to be above 5, because remember that at the end of the day, services account for a very large proportion of our GDP.
That will be the saving grace.
That will be the saving grace.
Now, the first big challenge on the horizon for the government is in fact the fiscal deficit target of 4.1%. On Thursday, this government has raised excise duties on petrol and diesel.
Things. On the other hand, there are some dimensions in which I had hoped they would do things and they have not happened.
All right, I want very much to talk about both of those areas where they acted where you didn't think they would act and therefore you're impressed, areas where you hoped they would act and they haven't and therefore you're disappointed. But let's come to that in a moment's time. when I take up the question about reforms and how bold this government is. Let's first begin with the state of the economy. In September, industrial production grew by 2.5%, inflation grew by only 5.5%, and both of those were better than anticipated. Does this suggest to you that growth is reviving and inflation is curbing, or is it too early to come to that conclusion?